Hey, welcome to my podcast where I discuss the origins of all sorts of things. I'm your host, Danny Payne, and this is On the Origin of Everything. A quick heads up before I get started. There's some mention of suicide in this episode, nothing more than a few sentences, but I felt it was important to include this trigger warning anyway. Alright, today I'm talking about board games. I like picking topics I know very little about, and this topic is no exception. My uneducated guess was that board games were a 20th century creation, maybe a 19th century creation, but definitely not any earlier than that. I was dead wrong. I usually am with these guesses, and I don't mind. I like being surprised by what I find. And what I found was that the oldest complete board game ever discovered is from 4,600 years ago in Mesopotamia. No one knows what the game was actually called, but it has come to be known as the Royal Game of Ur. Ur being an ancient Mesopotamian city, discovered in 1928. The game board has 20 squares, so it's also referred to as the game of the 20 squares. One end has 2 rows of 3, the other end has 4 rows of 3, and each end is connected by 2 squares. You'll have to look it up because it's kind of a weird arrangement. But get this, archaeologists found these game boards all over the Middle East, yet no one knew how to play the game until a certain Dr. Irving Finkel in the 1980s discovered a stone tablet with all the rules on it. You can actually Google the rules and play this ancient board game if you wanted. So that's the oldest complete board game we have ever found, but we know from wall paintings and ancient writings that 2 other board games existed in Egypt that date back even further. The game of Senet and the game of Mehen were around as early as 5,100 years ago. The Egyptians also played a game known as Hounds and Jackals, also known as the Palm Tree Game, also known as the Game of 58 Holes. Since we don't know what these old games were actually called, we just come up with names that describe what they look like. The result is multiple names for the same game, making researching this a bit confusing. All of the ancient board games I've mentioned so far came from the same general area. It would seem that Egypt and Mesopotamia were the only ancient civilizations that played board games, because I thought I had found a game from West Africa called Mancala, or Mancala, but its roots lead right back to Egypt. And backgammon traces its roots back to Mesopotamia. The cradle of civilization is also the cradle of board games, it seems. But I finally found some board games that originated in other parts of the world. The game of Weiqi originated in China some 4,000 years ago. This game is still played today, and it's known internationally as Go. Pachisi and Chowper are ancient board games that originated in India. A lot of sources place this game in the 16th century CE, but the peculiar dice specific to these 2 games have been unearthed and dated back to 4,000 years ago. If Pachisi reminded you of Parcheesi, it's because Parcheesi is the Western version of Pachisi. India also gave the world chess. Did you know that chess was an Indian board game originally? I didn't. Chess is not as old as those other ancient games. It's only 1,300 years old. Only. Its original name was Chaturanga, meaning the 4 limbs, referring to the 4 components of an army: elephants, horses, chariots, and foot soldiers. As chess spread to Europe, the game pieces changed to reflect the cultures of those who played it, and the rules also evolved over time. Isn't Chaturanga a yoga pose? I wouldn't know. Italy gave us the Royal Game of the Goose in the 15th century, and it's considered by some to have been the first modern board game, based on the merit that it was the first commercially manufactured game. Ancient civilizations in the Americas also played board games. The Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Toltecs all played a game called Patoli from as early as 200 BCE. These pre-Columbian civilizations played a number of other board games too, so it's becoming quite clear that for as long as there have been civilizations, there have been board games. To bring this closer to home, the first board game in the United States was published in 1822 by a cartography firm based in New York. The game was called The Traveler's Tour Through the United States, and the objective was to educate the players on the geography of the United States. You would spin a teetotum, which is a spinning top like a dreidel, and you would move your piece the number of spaces the teetotum produced. But in order to advance your piece, you'd have to first answer a question about that space, like the capital of the state or the population. The first person to reach New Orleans won. Seems like an odd finish line, but that's because there were only 24 states at the time. and Louisiana was at the western edge of the United States. I found one of these games on eBay selling for $2,000. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I say $2,000? I meant $20,000. So that was the first board game in America. But out of Salem, Massachusetts came an influential game called The Mansion of Happiness. It was an English game that was adapted for a Protestant American audience in 1843 by Anne Abbott, the daughter of a clergyman. If you were given the assignment to create a board game that the Puritans might have played, you'd come up with something like this. The full title of the game board was The Mansion of Happiness, an instructive moral and entertaining amusement. To play it, you would spin a teetotum, again, to get the number of spaces to move your piece, and the spaces were labeled with different virtues or vices. Landing on a virtue allowed you to move your piece 6 more spaces, while landing on a vice sent you backwards. The objective was to reach the final space labeled the Mansion of Happiness, obviously representing heaven. Let me read you the different spaces you could land on. For the virtue spaces, there was justice, piety, honesty, temperance, gratitude, prudence, truth, chastity, sincerity, humility, industry, charity, humanity, and generosity. For the vices, there was audacity, passion, idleness, cruelty, immodesty, Sabbath breaker, a cheat, a perjurer, a drunkard, a robber, ingratitude, and summit of dissipation. That one threw me. But I found out that dissipation was a common religious term used in the 18th and 19th century, referring to overindulgence and moral decay. There were also penalty spaces like the jail space in Monopoly. These were poverty, prison, ruin, the whipping post, the pillory, that's the wooden planks with the holes for your head and hands, the stocks, that's the same thing but for your feet, and there was a space that just said the water. What type of punishment are we talking about there? Well, I found an excerpt from the rules. Whoever gets into a passion must be taken to the water and have a ducking to cool him. So, taking a cold shower. Got it. The water space is near the beginning of the game, so if you land on passion, it's a pretty big penalty. This puritanical board game, as I'm choosing to call it, made its way into the hands of a young man named Milton Bradley. Recognize the name? I always thought Milton Bradley were 2 last names, like Baskin Robbins or Fisher Price. But nope. Anyway, Milton Bradley had been working as a lithographer, which is a way to make high-quality prints of illustrations. A similar effect of a printing press or a screen printer, but different. Just look up lithograph if you're curious. Business wasn't going well for Milton, partly due to having printed a bunch of posters of Abraham Lincoln right before growing his iconic beard, turning his once desirable beardless Lincoln posters into dead inventory almost overnight. One day he played The Mansion of Happiness, and it dawned on him that he had the means of making his own game with his lithograph. He shifted from making posters to making board games. The first game he created in 1860 combined elements of The Mansion of Happiness and checkers. He called it the Checkered Game of Life. It was a bit less religious than The Mansion of Happiness, but it was still centered around morals with positive spaces like honesty, bravery, and industry, and negative spaces like idleness, gambling, and crime. You would start the game on the infancy space, then spin a teetotum to move around the checkered board, earning points, and the first player to reach 100 points won. The college space awarded you 5 points, the wealth space was worth 10 points, and the happy old age space was worth 50 points. But watch out. If you land on the suicide space, game over. This isn't some dark joke. The Checkered Game of Life really had a space labeled suicide, with an illustration of a man hanging by a noose from a tree. Straight up. In 1960, 100 years after its release, Milton Bradley reintroduced the Checkered Game of Life as just the game of life, with some major modifications, like focusing more on being successful in life and less on morality. And they, of course, removed the suicide square. But back to 1860, Milton Bradley sold 45,000 of these Checkered Game of Life games in the first year. But then, the Civil War broke out, bringing his board game sales way down. Once again, he needed to make a change to keep making money, and there's some lore about him having walked by some soldiers who were killing time playing cards or something, and it inspired him to make a game small enough to fit into someone's pocket to carry around with them. Whatever the story actually is, the result was the same. Milton Bradley created the first travel-sized board game. It included dominoes, checkers, chess, and his very own checkered game of life. This little travel-sized game is what really established his brand, more so than the checkered game of life, because he sold 270,000 of them. How could that even be? Well, aside from all the movement of soldiers during the Civil War, by 1861 there had been 30,000 miles of railroad tracks laid across the country. People were traveling in unprecedented numbers. Modern tourism began in the 1860s too, so his little travel-sized game hit the market at the perfect time. So, Milton Bradley was owning the board game scene, right? But he would soon receive some competition from a young man named George Parker, also in Salem, Massachusetts. He took an existing game called Everlasting and modified it to be less preachy and more fun. He called it The Game of Banking. Published in 1883, this was the first non-Puritan game. Before this, pretty much all games had a religious purpose. There was even a game called Going to Sunday School, for crying out loud. But this game was way more secular, and it was still a success. I wondered why, because a game called The Game of Banking sounds so dull to me. Well, there's some cultural context to consider here. By the late 1800s, Americans fantasized about getting rich and becoming millionaires like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, who had come from nothing. The American dream was alive and well, and the objective of The Game of Banking was simply to get rich. This tapped into something new, the element of fantasy in board games. While Milton Bradley continued to produce games based on morals, George Parker brought to the market games that were centered on fun, fantasy, and adventure. And he eventually created the first role-playing games, predecessors to games like Dungeons & Dragons. Also, in the late 1800s, kids became a consumer base for the first time, so game makers, including Milton Bradley and Parker Brothers, started targeting kids. It's crazy to think that before that, board games were primarily for adults. You may have noticed that I said Parker Brothers. George Parker flew solo at first, but in 1888 his two brothers joined the business and the company became Parker Brothers. Let's talk about the most popular modern board game ever, Monopoly. This origin story begins at the turn of the century with a political activist named Elizabeth McGee, also known as Lizzie McGee. She was a Georgist, someone who subscribes to the philosophies of Henry George, who believed that land shouldn't belong to anyone, that land monopolies were responsible for poverty and inequality. Lizzie McGee wanted to spread awareness of these ideas through her board game that she called the Landlord's Game. It was designed to be played in two ways: the anti-monopoly rules, which rewarded all players as wealth was generated, and the pro-monopoly rules, which incentivized monopolies aimed to bankrupt the other players. The lesson to be learned by playing the Landlord's Game was to see the difference between the current state of things and how it could be if there was wealth gap reform. She self-published it in 1904, but needed help scaling it, so she went to George Parker for help. But because this game was morally charged, he decided to pass. The Landlord's Game never broke into the mainstream, but it did circulate among progressive circles like college campuses. Fast forward to the Great Depression. The story continues with a man named Charles Darrow. Like many Americans during the 1930s, he was struggling financially, out of work, and to pass the time he began to work on a board game that he called Monopoly, which resembled the Landlord Game's pro-monopoly rules. He pitched it to Milton Bradley, who passed, and he pitched it to Parker Brothers, who also passed. Instead of giving up on the whole thing, Charles Darrow took the risk of producing them himself and managed to get them into department stores, even at Schwartz. This was a make-it-or-break-it moment for Darrow. All of his eggs were in this basket, and the only thing left to do was wait and see if anyone would buy his Monopoly game through the Christmas season, in the middle of the Great Depression. As you may have already guessed, they flew off the shelves. Again, like George Parker's Game of Banking, Monopoly capitalized on the appeal of pretending to get rich. It's that fantasy thing again. These games are really, really fun. Now, When I read the part about Charles Darrow struggling financially, being out of work, and being bored enough to get creative and make a board game to pass the time, I did a head tilt. That didn't sound right to me. If you've ever had the misfortune of being unemployed, you know that sitting around bored is not something that happens. You're in survival mode, looking for work, being scrappy, doing odd jobs. You're not sitting around bored. You're not in a creative mindset unless what you're creating is potentially going to make you some money. Well, it turns out that I was right. That part about Charles Darrow's story was completely made up. He didn't create the game of Monopoly out of whole cloth. He ripped it off of Lizzie McGee's Landlord's game. He had played the Landlord's game, and when times got tough financially, he saw an opportunity to maybe make a living or a fortune selling his own version of that game. After Monopoly had made a splash, Parker Brothers realized its mistake of having passed on it and made a deal with Charles Darrow to fund the mass production of Monopoly under the Parker Brothers brand in 1935. Now, the game had gone to market before securing a patent, and when Parker Brothers applied for a patent, they were curiously denied. That's when the cat was out of the bag, and Parker Brothers had to find Lizzie McGee in a hurry to persuade her to relinquish the rights to her patent. They offered her $500, and she actually accepted the deal, with the condition that Parker Brothers would also manufacture her Landlord game, which they did, but it didn't sell many copies. That's not super surprising to me, because who wants to play a game that points out the injustice of their hopeless situation? People prefer to escape their problems, not look them straight in the face. As part of a PR move, Parker Brothers came up with that story about Charles Darrow having created the game to pass the time during the Great Depression. They even included that fake success story with every game. It wasn't until 1973 that Lizzie McGee's story was fully known to the public when someone tried to copyright a game called Anti-Monopoly, and the legal battle that ensued brought those details to the surface. I can't help but feel bad for Lizzie McGee, man. The irony of her story is crazy. She set out to sell a game that would bring widespread awareness about the unfairness of land and property monopolies, and it resulted in the popularization of a game that promotes the opposite. A game that has sold 275 million copies. That's some cruel, cruel irony. A few more things about Monopoly. The original one that Charles Darrow was peddling didn't provide game pieces. Parker Brothers changed that. They included those iconic pieces we still use today. And have you ever wondered where those property spaces came from? Baltic Avenue, St. James Place, Park Place, Boardwalk. Remember how the Landlord's game continued to circulate in niche markets? Well, there were different versions based on location, and the one that Charles Darrow was playing, the one he copied, came from Atlantic City. If you pull up a map, you'll see that the street names in Atlantic City correspond with all the spaces in Monopoly. So what was the deal with that teetotum thing? Why not just use dice? The early board games in America used teetotums instead of dice, and it was because dice were culturally associated with gambling addictions that led to financial ruin, and among religious circles, dice were linked to vices, idleness, temptation, and even satanic influence. The workaround was those teetotums. Instead of rolling dice, you would spin the teetotum to generate a number. I don't see what the difference is, but to people in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries in America, it certainly did make a difference. Face cards were stigmatized the same way dice were, too. Some people avoided playing cards altogether, but others substituted the traditional deck with a custom one that replaced the jack, queen, and king with religious figures or symbols of virtues. Some decks were just numbers and colors. Once again, I don't see how that makes any difference, but it definitely made a difference to them. Now, I grew up in a religious home, and I was always advised to not gamble, like ever. Gambling was on the same level as doing drugs. It was the gateway to ruin, and I recall our family opting to play games like Uno, but never games like poker. I don't think we even owned a deck of cards. It wasn't just our family either. Other families belonging to our church also used rook cards, which are just numbers and colors, to play card games. Now I'm realizing that these stigmas are lingering echoes of the Puritan era. What an unexpected origin to stumble upon. Board games have been a part of our lives since the dawn of civilization, and maybe earlier. They have provided us with way more than just something to do. They have reinforced morals, mirrored societal values, encouraged strategic thinking, and offered a way to escape reality for a moment and get lost in a fun fantasy. But I think the biggest thing they've done for us is that they have facilitated communal bonding. Board games really do bring people together. And that's all on the origin of board games. Stick around for the origin of billiards in part 2 of this episode, coming up right after this. This episode is brought to you by nothing. To help keep ads off this show, consider donating by clicking the Patreon link in the show notes or by going to patreon.com/ontheoriginofeverything. Another way you can support this show is by giving it a 5-star rating and review, or by following it, or sharing it. Let's build a community of people that are curious and always learning. Now, back to the show. Part 2 of this episode is on billiards, or pool. It's a somewhat peculiar game, isn't it? Striking a ball with a long stick to knock other balls into pockets on a big heavy table with a green top? Who came up with this? I'm about to blow your mind because golf, croquet, and billiards can all trace their origins back to the same ancient game called paganica. This outdoor game, which was played in ancient Rome during the time of Jesus, involved using a stick to hit a stuffed leather ball with the intent to hit a target. The person to hit the target with the fewest strokes won. As the Roman Empire grew and spread across Europe, paganica spread too. Over time, the game would evolve into an indoor game to escape unfavorable weather conditions, and by the 1300s, the stage was set for the earliest form of billiards. Lawn games, like croquet, made it indoors to be played on large tables with green tops to mimic grass. That's why pool tables are green. The early versions of billiards was basically table croquet. I'm reminded of the relationship between tennis and table tennis, though I have no idea if that's even a good comparison. But back to these early indoor, croquet-like table games. The tables had bumpers, or raised edges to keep the balls from rolling off. These are commonly known as cushions. The balls were made of wood, and the stick was not a pool cue yet. They used maces. A mace is best described as having 2 parts, the long staff and the flat end piece. Imagine a walking stick that is very straight, but the end that touches the ground is a bulkier, flatter piece with a curved side, like a hook. You're going to have to Google image them because they're really hard to describe. The important thing to know is that they did not look like a modern pool cue, and these maces were used to push the balls around, not strike them. The goal was to push balls through arches, like croquet. You might be picturing all of this taking place in a public setting, like a tavern, but you'd be wrong. This indoor table game was played only by nobility. It was even a status symbol to have one of these custom-made ornate tables in the parlor of your estate to entertain guests. And this early form of billiards remained among the elite through the 1400s and the 1500s, being played exclusively in royal courts and castles. But this period laid the foundation for the game we recognize today. This cue sport, as it is classified, began to evolve and standardize through the 1500s with the following changes. The balls went from being made of wood to being made of ivory, further emphasizing wealth, and the use of maces underwent a slight but significant shift. You see, any time a ball would rest against a cushion, it would be difficult to use the bulky end of a mace, so players started flipping the mace around to use the handle or the tail end of the mace to strike the ball off the cushion. This was the beginning of using the mace like a pool cue. The word cue is French for tail, and billiard is a French word from the 1590s that meant wooden cue stick. I love the etymology of this stuff. So we're in the 1600s, and the cue stick is now more widely used than the mace. And this is still primarily a game for the very wealthy, but for the first time, billiards entered public spaces. Not much, but a little bit. The cushions also got more cushiony. They went from being made of just wood to being made of leather, which provided more rebound, and the bank shot became more popular. The 1700s gave us the leather-tipped cue stick instead of just the wood-tipped ones, as well as the introduction of the pocket. The first pockets were to be avoided, not aimed for. It was also in the 1700s that the first billiard tables appeared in the American colonies, domestically made, not imported, and more they were seen among the lower classes. The 1800s brought more significant changes to the game, like chalk. The purpose of chalk was to prevent miscues, which is when you don't make direct contact with the cue ball, and experience extreme embarrassment. We've all been there. Chalk also allows for trick shots, making the game more fun. And in the 1800s, we finally stopped using balls made out of ivory. Not for ethical reasons, but for supply reasons. We almost brought elephants to extinction. So it's good that we switched to celluloid balls, celluloid being the first commercially successful plastic. Today, billiard balls are made of phenolic resin, the same material bowling balls are made of. The prominent billiard game in America during the 1800s was 4-ball billiards, played on a table with 4 balls and 4 pockets. This game was later surpassed in popularity by its 2 successors, straight rail, the predecessor to all carom games, and American 15-ball pool, the predecessor of modern pocket billiards. The game we know here in the United States is 8-ball pool, which arose at the turn of the last century. There are so many ways to play billiards, so many ways to count points, different numbers of balls, different colors of balls, different numbers of pockets, sometimes no pockets at all. Even the size of the table can differ. And it's important to know that colonization introduced billiards to 100 countries or so, leading to dozens and dozens of variations of the game. And I was very happy to avoid going into all of that. Now, we've gone from Paganica to cue sports to billiards, but where did we get pool from? In the 19th century, a pool room was a betting parlor for horse races. We've all heard of the term betting pool related to sports betting, so these were pool rooms for betting on horses. Billiard tables ended up in these pool rooms for patrons to pass the time between horse races. And eventually, billiard tables began to be called pool tables, and billiards began to be called pool. And a pool room or a pool hall is now a place to play pool. Pretty neat. What a journey billiards has taken, from outdoor grasses to indoor tables, and from royal courts and castles to local bars, from being played by kings, queens, and aristocrats, to being played by you and me. I'm absolute trash at pool, but this has inspired me to find opportunities to play more. Pool is always a good time. That wraps it up for today, guys. Another lengthy episode. This was a really fun one for us, and we hope you enjoyed it too. Until next time, so long. Research, music, and production was all done by Jezere Wilson. This podcast is listener-supported, owned and operated by Jez and myself under the On the Origin of Everything LLC in the United States. All rights reserved. We can be reached via email at info@ontheoriginpod.com.